A hush settled over the grand concert hall of Whitehaven Manor, where the final notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major still lingered in the air. The audience, entranced by the spellbinding performance of the renowned pianist Claude Lenglet, had barely begun to applaud when something peculiar happened. Lenglet, who had just executed a flawless recital, sat frozen at the piano, his hands hovering above the keys. His expression was one of utter confusion, his eyes wide, lips slightly parted as if he had witnessed a ghost. Then, without a sound, he collapsed forward, his head striking the keyboard with a discordant crash. The crowd gasped. The host of the evening, Baron Leckler, rushed to the stage, but it was too late. Claude Lenglet was dead, the immediate shock turned to confusion when Dr. Fournier, a physician among the guests, declared there were no visible wounds, no sign of poisoning, nothing to suggest how Lenglet had died. The pianist's body was removed, and the stunned audience was ushered out into the cold November night. But the strangest discovery came minutes later, when Madame Lenglet, the pianist's wife, arrived in hysterics. He didn't know that. Peace, she cried. Claude never learned Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. He never played it in his life. The claim sent a ripple of unease through those still present. How could a pianist perform a composition he had never learned? And why had he died so suddenly? A call was placed to the most famous detective in Europe. By the next morning, Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room of Whitehaven Manor, impeccably dressed as always. His keen eyes took in every detail, the opulent surroundings, the gilded frame of a portrait above the piano, the polished ivory keys still bearing the faint impression of Lenglet's fingertips. He turned to the Baron, his voice smooth and measured. "You say he played perfectly?" Poirot asked. Baron Leckler nodded. "Magnificent. Every note in place, and yet Madame Lenglet insists he never learned the piece?" "Oui, Leckler." "Confirmed." She was adamant. Poirot moved closer to the piano, running a gloved finger across the keys. "Tell me, monsieur, was he scheduled to perform this nocturne?" "No," Leckler admitted. "His program included only Liszt and Ravel. The Chopin was." "Unexpected. Très curieux," Poirot murmured. "Something is not right, mon ami." The detective turned to the small audience still gathered. Madame Lenglet, pale and trembling, the stage manager, Etienne Giraud, the physician, Dr. Fournier, and a handful of lingering guests. His gaze settled on the pianist's wife. "Madame, forgive me, but how can you be certain your husband never learned this nocturne?" Tears glistened in her eyes. "Because he hated Chopin," she said quietly. "He found his compositions too sentimental. He swore he would never play them." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And yet, last night, he played one flawlessly." A heavy silence fell over the room. The sheer impossibility of it made the air feel thick. Poirot folded his arms and paced slowly. "Messieurs, it seems to me, we have two mysteries, but perhaps they are one and the same. A man plays a song he never learned, and he dies moments later. We must ask ourselves, did the playing of the nocturne lead to his death?" His gaze landed on the piano again. He stepped forward and pressed a key. The soft, pure note rang out. He pressed another. The same. He tested several more, his brow furrowing. There is no sign of tampering, he mused. No mechanism to deliver poison. No unusual residue. He turned to Dr. Fournier. Monsieur, was there any indication that Monsieur Anglais suffered from illness? None, the doctor replied. A healthy man, as far as I know. Then we must consider, how does one die without a wound, without poison, without a struggle? Poirot's eyes gleamed. The answer, mis amis, lies in the music. Poirot let his fingertips rest lightly on the polished surface of the piano, his mind racing beneath the composed exterior. The death of Claude Langlais had no apparent cause, no visible wound, no trace of poison, no struggle, yet something had silenced him forever. At the precise moment, he played a piece he had never learned. Poirot did not believe in the supernatural. There was an answer, and it was hidden somewhere in this room. As he stepped back, he noted how the others were watching him. Madame Langlais clutched a lace handkerchief, her eyes rimmed with tears. Dr. Fournier stood with the weight of a man who had no answers, while Baron Leckler shifted impatiently, clearly eager for this matter to be resolved. The stage manager, Etienne Giraud, lingered by the piano, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Poirot observed each of them, not with suspicion yet, but with calculation. From the doorway, a heavy tread signaled the arrival of Inspector Renaud, of the local police. The man was tall, with a square jaw and a mustache that, to Poirot's silent dismay, was neither symmetrical nor well-groomed. He swept into the room with the air of one who had already formed his conclusions. "We have sent Langlais' body for examination," he announced, as if this alone would resolve everything. "But I suspect we will find little. No sign of foul play. It is possible his heart simply failed him." Poirot's mustache quivered. His heart failed him at the precise moment he played a piece of music he had never studied. "No, mon cher, that is a coincidence I cannot accept, Inspector." Renaud exhaled sharply. "Then what do you suggest?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he let his eyes drift once more around the room, absorbing the details others overlooked. His gaze settled on the piano stool. It was slightly off-center, a mere inch, perhaps, but Poirot noticed such things. "Tell me, Monsieur Giraud," he said, turning to the stage manager, "did you make any adjustments to the piano before Langlais' performance?" Giraud hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing. He arrived, sat down, and played." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. The hesitation was subtle, but it was there, and before that, was the stool moved? Giraud scratched his head. "Perhaps one of the stage hands dusted it, but no one would dare tamper with it." Poirot stepped closer, crouching beside the stool. He ran a gloved hand underneath it, feeling along the edges. His fingers brushed something smooth, a tiny disc no larger than a coin, affixed just beneath the seat. He carefully pried it free and examined it in the light. It was a thin metal device, almost unnoticeable. He turned it over in his palm. A small indentation in the center. A design so discreet it would escape anyone who was not looking for it. What is it? Renaud asked impatiently. Poirot studied the device before answering. A mystery, he said simply. He slipped it into his pocket and rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. Then, turning back to the room, his voice took on a more casual tone. Tell me, Madame Langlais, did your husband practice before his performance? She blinked at the sudden change of subject. No, she said quietly. Claude never practiced before a concert. He said it ruined the spontaneity of the music. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And before he played last night, how did he seem? She hesitated, as if replaying the moment in her mind. He was distracted. Not nervous, but distant. Poirot's gaze flicked to Giraud. You were with him before the performance, were you not? The stage manager stiffened. Yes, briefly. Just backstage. He seemed normal. Did he say anything? Giraud glanced away for the briefest moment. Nothing important. Poirot caught at the deflection. Giraud was hiding something. Poirot moved toward the piano again, his fingers trailing lightly across the keys. Tell me, Monsieur Giraud, was this the same piano Langlais always played? Yes, Giraud answered quickly. He insisted on it. Poirot nodded, storing the information away. Then he turned to Inspector Renaud. Tell me, mon ami, when can I expect the results of the post-mortem? Tomorrow morning. Bon. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Then, for now, I shall retire and think. He turned toward the door, then paused. Oh, one last thing. Who chose the program for last night's performance? Madame Langlais frowned. Claude did every piece? Yes, except, Poirot said softly. For the nocturne, a silence settled over the room. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, that is what I thought, and with that, he departed. Leaving behind a room of uneasy faces, the morning air was crisp as Poirot stepped into the drawing-room of Whitehaven Manor once more, his mind as sharp as ever despite the restless night he had spent contemplating the mysteries of Claude Langlais. Death. The others had already gathered Madame Langlais seated stiffly on a velvet settee, Baron Leckler standing near the window, arms crossed, while Etienne Giraud occupied a chair near the fireplace, his fingers drumming against his knee. Inspector Renaud was also present, looking slightly irritated at Poirot's insistence on another round of questioning before the post-mortem results arrived. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice light yet deliberate. We have a most intriguing puzzle before us. A pianist plays a song he never learned, then dies with no visible cause. We must ask ourselves, what truth is being concealed? And more importantly, by whom? He turned his gaze to Madame Langlais first. Madame, I must ask again, was there anything unusual about your husband's behavior in the days leading up to the performance? She exhaled slowly, gripping her handkerchief. I already told you, he was distracted. More so than usual. Poirot inclined his head. You say, more so than usual. Was distraction a common trait for Monsieur Langlais? She hesitated. Claude was an artist, Monsieur Poirot. His mind was often elsewhere, consumed by music, but not by Chopin. Poirot murmured. And yet, he played Chopin's nocturne last night. What could have caused him to do such a thing? He studied her closely. Did he mention anyone new in his life? A stranger, perhaps? She hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second. No, Poirot's gaze flickered to the others. Monsieur Leclerc, he continued, addressing the Baron, you hosted last night's performance. Did you speak with Langlais before he took the stage? Leclerc frowned. Briefly. He arrived, exchanged pleasantries. Nothing seemed out. Of the ordinary, Poirot tapped his chin. Nothing at all. A change in demeanor? A nervous energy? Leclerc shook his head. No, I swear it. Poirot turned his attention to Giraud. The stage manager sat stiffly, his jaw tight. Monsieur Giraud, I believe you were the last to see him before he performed. Giraud's gaze darted up. Yes, he said quickly. I checked on him backstage, and how was he? A pause. Fine. Focused. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Focused, yes, Giraud said, shifting in his chair. He always had a certain intensity before playing. Poirot studied him for a moment, then moved toward the piano, running his fingers along the polished surface. Tell me, Monsieur Giraud, what do you think of Chopin? Giraud blinked. I don't understand. Poirot turned. Langlais despised Chopin. It is well known. And yet, last night, he played Chopin's nocturne flawlessly. Did that not strike you as odd? Giraud hesitated. Of course, but you said nothing. The man's mouth opened, then closed. A flicker of unease crossed his face. Poirot smiled faintly. A strange thing, is it not? Inspector Renaud, who had been watching with increasing impatience, finally cut in. Are we to suspect everyone simply because they find a death unusual? Poirot held up a hand. Ah, but you see, mon ami, I do not suspect everyone. I merely observe. And when people hesitate, when they hold back even the smallest detail, I must ask why. His gaze swept back to Giraud. Monsieur, did Langlais say anything to you before he went on stage? Giraud swallowed. No, Poirot's mustache twitched. No, Giraud exhaled, then glanced at Madame Langlais before speaking. Fine, he said. It's too late now. A hush fell over the room. Poirot's expression did not change. And you did not think to mention this? Giraud's fingers curled into his palms. I didn't think it mattered. Poirot nodded slowly. A curious choice of words, is it not? It's too late now. Too late for what, I wonder? He turned back to Madame Langlais. Does this mean anything to you, madam? Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, Poirot thought she might deny it. Then softly, she said, No, I don't know what he meant. Poirot did not miss the slight tremor in her voice. He turned next to Inspector Renaud. Tell me, mon ami, are there any missing persons reported in the area? The inspector blinked. Missing persons? What does that have to do with this? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Renaud sighed. No reports, but I can inquire. Poirot smiled. Do so, Sylvaus Platt. Then, with a final glance around the room, he clasped his hands behind his back. Mes amis, I do believe the truth is beginning to show itself just as a melody emerges from the first few notes of a song. Poirot paced the drawing room with slow, measured steps, his mind sifting through the tangled threads of the case. A man dead at the piano, a song he never learned yet played with perfection, and a final cryptic phrase, "It's too late now." Every element hinted at a larger truth, one that lay just beneath the surface. But what was the connection? And more importantly, who among them had something to gain from Langlay's death? He turned sharply, fixing his gaze on Baron Leckler. Monsieur, let us consider something. You are generous enough to host this concert, and you are also one of Langlay's patrons, were you not? Leckler straightened, his expression carefully neutral. Yes, I supported his work. His talent was undeniable. Talent, oui, Poirot murmured. But genius alone does not pay the bills, non? Was Langlais in any financial distress? A flicker of something passed across Leckler's face. He never spoke of money with me, but artists are rarely wealthy. I imagine he struggled, as most do. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, he refused to play music that was not of his own choosing. Even for a patron? Leckler hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Claude was stubborn. He would not compromise his principles, not even for financial gain. Poirot hummed thoughtfully. Then tell me, monsieur, was there a disagreement between you? Leckler's mouth pressed into a thin line. A minor one. I suggested a piece I thought would suit the evening Chopin, ironically enough, but he refused. That was the end of it. Poirot noted how the Baron's fingers tightened around his glass of brandy. Curious, is it not, that despite his refusal, he ended up playing precisely that music? A muscle twitched in Leckler's jaw, but he said nothing. Poirot let the silence stretch before turning his attention back to Madame Langlais. Madame, let us speak frankly. A wife often knows her husband's troubles better than anyone. Did Langlais have enemies? Her fingers twisted in her lap, the lace of her handkerchief knotted between them. Claude was not a man who made enemies, Monsieur Poirot. He was difficult, yes, but not cruel. Poirot watched her carefully. And yet, something troubled him before his performance. You must have noticed, her lips parted slightly, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of revealing something. Then she shook her head. He was distant, but he often was before a concert. Poirot let out a quiet sigh. Ah, madam, you are careful with your words. But let me ask you something more direct. Did Claude ever speak of someone from his past? Someone who might have returned unexpectedly? She flinched, ever so slightly, before she could mask it. No, she said too quickly. Poirot's gaze sharpened. I see. He turned to Giraud, who had been silent until now, his hands still clenching his knees. And you, Monsieur Giraud, stage managers know many secrets. Did Langlais confide in you? Giraud hesitated, his throat working as if forcing down an answer. He said something odd. The night before the concert, Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Go on, Giraud licked his lips. He said, a man cannot outrun his own melody. A hush settled over the room. Poirot exhaled softly. A man cannot outrun his own melody. It was a poetic phrase, one that spoke of fate, of inevitability. Poirot let the words hang before pressing further. And did he say to whom this melody belonged? Giraud swallowed hard. No, but he seemed afraid, fear. Poirot had sensed it lingering in the air since the moment he arrived. It was woven into the very fabric of this crime. Fear of what? Exposure? Retribution? He needed more. Tell me, Giraud, he continued, who had access to the piano before the concert. The stage manager frowned. Anyone in the staff, I suppose. The tuning was done in the afternoon, and after that, only Claude touched it. Poirot tapped his chin. Except for one thing, he reached into his pocket and retrieved the small, smooth device he had found beneath the piano stool. This, Giraud paled. What is that? Poirot studied him. You do not know? Giraud shook his head quickly. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Curious, he turned back to the room. Mes amis, let us look at what we know. L'Anglais, a man known for his control, for his defiance, suddenly plays a piece he would never have chosen. He whispers cryptic words before his performance. He dies without a mark upon him. And above all, we have a fear that lingers in the air like the echo of a final note. Why? No one answered. Poirot straightened, adjusting his cuffs. The answer, mes amis, lies in the past. Someone here knows the truth. Someone has been waiting for what? I do not yet know. But I assure you, I will find out. The hush that had settled over the drawing room remained unbroken for several long moments. Poirot let the silence stretch, observing the tension in the air. Eyes flickered toward him, toward each other, and toward the object in his hand, the strange, smooth device found beneath the piano stool. It was small, unobtrusive, yet its presence was unnatural, an intruder in the otherwise perfect world of a concert performance. It did not belong there, and that, Poirot knew, was precisely why it mattered. Inspector Renaud, impatient as ever, finally exhaled sharply. So what now, Poirot? You have a gadget, some cryptic words, and a dead man who played an unexpected tune. Do you expect me to arrest someone based on riddles? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mon ami, how quick you are to seek an ending. But you see, a good detective does not force a melody to its final note too soon. We must listen to all the variations first. Renaud folded his arms. Then perhaps you'll be pleased to know that we do have something substantial. The results from the post-mortem have just arrived. He pulled a folded report from his pocket. Shaking it open with deliberate emphasis, the room held its breath. Well? Leclerc pressed, his fingers tight around his glass. Renaud's lips twisted. Poison. Poirot's head tilted ever so slightly. Poison? A rare one. No marks, no struggle. absorbed through the skin, apparently. Subtle, effective, a murmur rippled through the room. Madame Langlais pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. My God! Poirot's fingers brushed his mustache. And where, mon cher Renaud, do you propose this poison came from? Renaud smirked, as if he had been waiting for the question. From the very piano keys Langlais touched, he paused for effect. And as it happens, we've found fingerprints on those keys. Fresh ones, the air thickened. Whose? Poirot asked. Though he already knew what was coming, Inspector Renaud turned to face Etienne Giraud. Yours, a gasp. Giraud's chair. Scraped as he jerked up, his face drained of all color. What? That's absurd. Poirot remained still. Ah, he murmured. Voile. I tuned the piano. I touched the keys before Langlais played. That's not proof of anything. Giraud protested, looking frantically around the room for support. I had no reason to kill him. No reason? Renaud scoffed. You worked. Closest to him, had access to the piano, and you admit yourself that you saw him before he played. You were the last person to speak to him. You're the only one who could have poisoned the keys without raising suspicion. This is ridiculous. Poirot lifted a hand, quieting the rising commotion. His eyes remained fixed on Giraud. Monsieur, tell me when you last saw Langlais. Was he already seated at the piano? Giraud hesitated. And no, he was standing, and... You say he seemed afraid. Yes. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And yet, he did not recoil from the piano, non. He did not hesitate to play. Giraud blinked. I suppose not. Poirot smiled, a sharp gleam behind his eyes. Curious, then, is it not? A man who is afraid does not sit so willingly before his own execution, Renaud groaned. Poirot, must you always complicate things? The fingerprints, the poisoned. Keys, everything points to Giraud. Oh, yes, Poirot mused, pacing slowly. So convenient, n'est-ce pas? I work with pianos. Of course, my fingerprints are there. Giraud shouted. Poirot turned back to Renaud. And tell me, mon ami, have you tested the fingerprints of the victim? Renaud frowned. What? Poirot spread his hands. The poison was absorbed through. The skin, oui. If Langlais was poisoned via the piano keys, then his own fingerprints should be there as well. Fresh ones. Renaud faltered. Poirot's voice softened, but the edge of steel remained. Tell me, Inspector, are they? Renaud's. Silence was answer enough. The weight of the room shifted. Suspicion, once tightly coiled around Giraud, now loosened just enough for doubt to seep in. Poirot exhaled, adjusting his cuffs. Let me tell you what I see, mes amis. A crime most devious, designed to be solved too quickly. A suspect presented. To us like the final act of a play too neat, too simple. The true culprit. They are clever, as intelligent. They have placed the pieces where they must be, ensuring that we look only where they wish us to look. His gaze swept across the faces in the room. And yet, the truth, she does not like to be controlled for long, Leclerc cleared his throat. Then what is the truth, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot smiled faintly. Patience, Baron. We are almost. There, he turned back to Renaud. Do not make an arrest tonight, mon ami. Do not close this case too soon. Renaud scowled. And what if we let the real killer slip through our fingers? Poirot's gaze darkened. Oh, I do not think they will run. No, no, they are far too invested in this game. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Poirot let it settle before he spoke again. His voice quiet but firm. They are still here. A hush settled over the room, thick with tension. Eyes darted toward one another, searching, measuring. Poirot stood in the center, hands clasped neatly before him, the glint in his eye sharper than before. The declaration had been made. The true culprit was among them. And yet, the final note of this mystery had not yet been played. It was then that a soft, almost reluctant voice broke through the silence. There was another time. All heads turned toward Madame Langlais. She sat rigid in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched at the folds of her skirt. Poirot's gaze settled on her, patient yet piercing. Another time, madam? He prompted gently. She exhaled shakily. A case. A scandal, really. Many years ago, Leclerc frowned. What are you talking about? Madame Langlais hesitated. But there was no turning back now. It was before you arrived in Paris, Baron, she said. It involved a musician. A pianist like my husband, her voice wavered. Like Tien, Giraud, who had been quiet since Poirot had drawn suspicion away from him, suddenly straightened. What do you mean, like me? She turned toward him, something sorrowful in her expression. He was a young talent, full of promise. A rising star, they called him. Her lips tightened. But he was accused of something terrible. A theft. Money stolen from a patron who had sponsored his studies. A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And what happened to him? Madame Langlais swallowed. He disappeared. Giraud let out a hollow laugh. And you think this has something to do with tonight? Poirot stepped closer. Disappeared, madame? Or was he made to disappear? She flinched. He was shamed, ruined. He had no family, no means to fight back. The world swallowed him whole. Poirot turned slightly, addressing the room. Tell me, mes amis, who was this patron? A pause. Then Baron Leclerc, all eyes snapped. Toward him. The older man stiffened, a shadow crossing his features. You knew this pianist, Poirot said, his voice steady. Leclerc's jaw tightened. It was a disgrace, he muttered. I trusted the boy. I funded his education, his rise to fame. And he repaid me with betrayal, or so you believed. Poirot's tone was deceptively light. Tell me, Baron, did you ever recover the stolen money? Leclerc hesitated. No, but the evidence was overwhelming. Poirot's brow arched. Evidence provided by whom? A flicker of discomfort passed over Leclerc's face. It was never him. A quiet voice spoke up. They turned to see the pale, trembling figure of Juliette Langlais, standing near the doorway. Her face was ghostly in the dim light. Madame Langlais gasped. Juliet, the young woman's eyes glistened. It wasn't him. I know it wasn't. Leckler's expression darkened. How can you possibly know that? Because she whispered. I knew who really took the money. Silence fell. Poirot tilted his head. Mademoiselle, please. Continue. Her hands clenched at her sides. I was young, but I remember. My father was friends with the pianist. He believed in him, and he was the only one who did. She looked at Leckler. The real thief was someone you trusted even more. A long pause. The man who handled all your accounts. The one who arranged all of your finances. The room seemed to close in. Leckler's breath came unsteady. No, he said hoarsely. No, that's not possible. It was your secretary, wasn't it? Poirot interjected. The man who disappeared just after the scandal broke. Leckler's lips parted, but no sound came. The weight of realization bore down on him. Poirot nodded, as if the last note of a long-forgotten melody had finally played. And so, an innocent man was ruined, his name blackened forever. He looked at Giraud. And that young man, condemned by society, forced to flee with nothing, he did not disappear entirely, did he? Giraud's fingers curled against his coat. No, he whispered. Poirot's voice softened. Because he is standing here, in this very room, a sharp intake of breath, Giraud's head lowered, his shoulders shaking slightly. When he looked up, his eyes burned. I was that boy, a stunned silence. I did nothing. He whispered, his voice thick with years of pain. But I was guilty in their eyes. I lost everything. My home, my future, he swallowed. And I had to become someone else. Poirot nodded solemnly. And so, you became Tien Giraud. Juliet took a hesitant step forward. I knew. She murmured. I knew when I first saw you. Giraud turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. You knew? She nodded. I remembered your face. Even after all these years, Poirot exhaled. And so, mes amis, we see the shape of this tragedy more clearly. A past injustice, left to fester in the dark, has finally resurfaced. He turned back to Leckler. The Baron, visibly shaken, collapsed into a chair. I was wrong, he murmured. My God, I was wrong. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Yes, Baron. And someone else knew it too. Someone who used that knowledge to orchestrate a crime most cunning. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of revelation. The past had finally bled into the present. But there was one final piece missing, and Poirot would not rest until he found it. A heavy silence lingered, thick with the weight of revelation. Faces around the room bore varying degrees of shock, disbelief, and something deeper guilt. Hercule Poirot remained still, his sharp gaze sweeping over each individual, watching, waiting. The truth had begun to surface, but the full picture remained elusive. There was still a piece missing, a final note that had yet to be played. He turned to Tien Giraud, the man once known as the young pianist who had been wrongfully accused. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from rage or sorrow was unclear. Tell me, monsieur, Poirot said gently, "When did you first learn the truth?" Giraud exhaled slowly. "Not until years later, when I finally pieced together what had happened. It was too late. My name was already lost, my life already rewritten." He looked at Leckler. "I hated you for it, for believing the lie, for never questioning what really happened." Leckler's expression was hollow. He had built his life on certainty, on control. Now he saw how blind he had been. Poirot nodded. "And yet, despite this great injustice, you did not act against him. You continued your life, hidden in plain sight, building your career." His mustache twitched. "Until tonight." Giraud's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Poirot turned toward the piano, stepping closer with measured precision. His fingers traced the polished surface, then lifted to hover just above the keys. "Tell me, monsieur, the piece you played that night, the one you claimed never to have learned, why did you play it?" A flicker of hesitation. "I don't know," Giraud admitted. "Ah, but I think you do." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Music, monsieur, is not merely notes on a page. It is memory, emotion. It lingers within us, even when we do not realize it." Giraud's gaze dropped to the piano, his fingers twitching slightly, as if itching too. "Play once more." Poirot's voice softened. "Tell me, did someone else play it once?" A pause. Then a nod. "Yes," Giraud murmured. "He did." The room tensed. Poirot turned toward the others. "You see, mes amis, this piece was not chosen by accident. It was a message." Juliette Langlais took a slow step forward, her face pale. "A message?" Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Oui, but not from Monsieur Giraud. From the true culprit." A ripple of confusion passed through the group. Poirot exhaled, lifting his hands slightly, as if arranging invisible pieces of a puzzle. "Consider, if you will, the peculiarity of this case. A murder committed with precision. A pianist who plays a song he never learned. A past scandal, long buried, suddenly resurfacing. Do you not see, mes amis? The answer is staring us in." The face, his sharp gaze landed on Madame Langlais. She stiffened. Monsieur Poirot, I don't understand, but you do." He interrupted, his voice smooth but firm. "You have understood from the beginning, because you knew the truth. Long before any of us." Her breath hitched. "That's absurd." Poirot stepped closer. "Is it?" The room seemed to shrink around her. Eyes turned toward her, suspicion flickering. Poirot's tone remained deceptively calm. "Tell me, madam, how long have you known the real fate of the young pianist from years ago?" A muscle in her jaw twitched. You knew." Poirot continued. "And tonight you ensured that the truth would finally be heard. But not with words, no." He gestured toward the piano. "With music. The air was thick with tension. It was you who arranged for that piece to be played, was it not?" She said nothing. Poirot tilted his head. "You knew that Monsieur Giraud would recognize it, that it would stir something deep within him. And most importantly, you knew it would force the past to the surface." Leckler sat forward, his voice hoarse. Why, Madame Langlais finally met his gaze. Her eyes shimmered, but not with tears. With fury, because I loved him. She whispered, a stunned silence. Poirot nodded, as if he had known all along. You loved the young pianist, the one who was accused unjustly, the one who was destroyed by a crime he did not commit. His gaze sharpened. But you did not act then, did you? You remained silent. Her lips trembled. I was afraid. I didn't know the full truth. I only learned what truly happened. Years later, her voice cracked. And by then, it was too late. Poirot took another step. Until tonight, her breathing was ragged now. You played the song, he said softly. You planted the final clue. Because you wanted the truth to be heard at last, she closed her eyes. Yes, Leckler looked as though the breath had been stolen from him. Juliet whispered, then, you didn't kill him? Poirot's mustache twitched. No, mademoiselle. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room once more. The true murderer is still among us. A chill settled over the group. Poirot's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. And they will soon realize there is no more room to hide. A tense silence gripped the room, the weight of revelation still pressing upon those gathered. Madame. Langlais stood frozen, her confession lingering in the air like a final note played on a dying piano. Poirot's gaze remained sharp, scanning each face in turn. He had declared that the true murderer was still among them, and now the room was thick with the unspoken question who. The air stirred as Chief Inspector Gerard shifted, clearing his throat. Monsieur Poirot, if you know who the killer is. I suggest we bring this to an end now. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the grand piano once more, his fingers tracing the polished surface before tapping one particular key, the same note that had begun this entire mystery. A single tone rang out, hollow and stark in the heavy silence. He turned his head slightly. No, mon ami. The final note has not yet been played. Before Gerard could protest, a loud crash echoed from the adjacent study. Every head snapped toward the doorway. For a moment, no one moved, each waiting to see if the sound would repeat, if an unseen presence would reveal itself. Then, without a word, Poirot moved, his steps precise yet swift, the others following in an anxious flurry. The study was in chaos. A small wooden cabinet that had been locked earlier now stood ajar. The doors wrenched open, papers strewn across the desk and floor. More importantly, the drawer where the police had placed the sheet music, the one found in Maestro Leckler's study, was empty. Gone. Gerard cursed under his breath, storming forward. The evidence, yes, Poirot murmured, his expression unreadable. The evidence has vanished. Juliet's hands flew to her mouth. But how? No one left the room. Poirot crouched slightly, eyes scanning the floor. He plucked up a sheet of parchment that had been crumpled in haste, but discarded as unimportant. His gaze flickered as he studied it. It was taken in great urgency, he said. But not all of it. Leckler stepped forward. Are you saying they only took the sheet music? Poirot rose slowly. We. The thief did not have time to cover their tracks fully. They knew precisely what they needed. He turned to Gerard. Tell me, mon ami, who had access to this study. Gerard frowned. Only myself and a few officers. The guests were all in the parlor with us. Poirot's mustache twitched. Were they? A hush fell over them. Then a sudden realization dawned upon the group. There was a moment. Juliet whispered, eyes wide. Right before you spoke, Monsieur Poirot, when everyone was reacting to Madame Langlay's confession. Poirot nodded approvingly. We. A distraction. In that brief window, the culprit acted. A single moment of chaos was all they needed. Gerard swore under his breath. We must search the house. Poirot lifted a hand. No, the inspector faltered. No, Poirot turned, his keen eyes landing on the fireplace. The embers still glowed faintly from earlier, but a new disturbance marked the hearth ashes, fresh and scattered, the remnants of paper burned in haste. They did not steal it to keep, Poirot murmured. They stole it to destroy, a dreadful. Understanding washed over the room. The sheet music, Leckler breathed. It's gone. Poirot's gaze lingered on the ashes. Not entirely. He turned to Gerard. Have your men recover whatever remains. Ink leaves traces, even in fire. Gerard barked orders, sending officers scrambling to collect the charred fragments. Juliet's voice trembled. But why? Why would they go to such lengths? Poirot faced the group once more, his expression unreadable. Because that sheet was the key to everything. A heavy stillness fell. Poirot took a slow step forward, his voice steady. Whoever killed Maestro Leckler feared what that sheet would reveal. And now they have risked everything to erase it. His gaze sharpened. Which means, mes amis, we are very, very close. The faint scent of burnt paper still lingered in the study as the officers carefully collected the charred remains of the stolen sheet music. Poirot stood motionless by the fireplace, hands neatly clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the dying embers. His mind was racing. The act of destruction was a desperate move, yet one that spoke volumes. The true murderer was not just afraid of being discovered. They were cornered before he could speak. A commotion erupted from the hallway. A sharp cry, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Poirot turned just as Juliet rushed into the room, her face pale, eyes wide with alarm. Inspector Gerard. She gasped. It's Madame Langlais. Something's happened. She's collapsed. Poirot's expression darkened. Without hesitation, he strode past her, following the panicked voices into the parlor where they had left Madame Langlais just moments before. The once elegant woman was slumped over in an armchair, her delicate lace gloves still clutched in her lap. Her lips were parted, her breathing shallow. Beside her, Leckler knelt, patting her wrist frantically. She's burning up, he murmured. And barely responsive, Poirot crouched beside the woman, his sharp eyes scanning her trembling form. He lifted one of her gloves, turning it over in his fingers. The lace was pristine, untouched, except for a faint stain near the fingertips. A smudge of deep crimson, blending into the fabric, Mon Dieu, Gerard muttered. Poison, Poirot's mustache twitched. Oui, mon ami. And not merely an accident. Juliet took a step back, horror washing over her features. But she only just confessed. Why would someone try to kill her now? Poirot studied Madame Langlay's face, his mind already piecing together the answer. Because, mademoiselle, she was not the murderer, a hushed silence fell over the room. Even Gerard's usual skepticism faltered. She admitted to the theft to blackmail, Poirot continued, his voice calm yet certain. But she never admitted to killing Maestro Leckler. She merely assumed guilt over her involvement, but someone more dangerous needed her silenced before she could think to defend herself. Leckler swallowed hard. Then the real killer is still here. Poirot gave a single grave nod. And they are watching us even now. Gerard cursed under his breath before snapping orders to the officers nearby. Get a doctor. And no one leaves the house, understood? The room remained tense as 2 officers rushed off to summon medical assistance. Madame Langlay's breaths grew shallower, her body trembling slightly in her seat. Poirot stood, turning toward the tea tray that sat nearby. A half-empty cup rested on the silver tray, the remnants of her drink untouched save for the last sip she had taken. Poirot lifted it delicately, bringing it close to his nose. A faint bitterness lingered beneath the floral scent of the tea. Gerard eyed it warily. Laced? Poirot nodded. Most certainly. But not in haste, no. This was prepared before. Our confrontation. The culprit had already anticipated the need to silence her. Juliet's hands trembled. That means they knew she would speak. Exactly, Poirot murmured. Which means the true murderer is not merely covering their tracks, but staying several steps ahead. They are weaving a narrative even as we speak, trying to control who remains in the light and who fades into shadow. Gerard exhaled sharply. Then we're not just solving a crime, we're trying to stop the next one. Poirot turned back to Madame Langlay, whose breathing had steadied slightly, though she remained barely conscious. She is not yet gone, he murmured. And that is where the killer has made their mistake. He set the teacup down with precision. They thought her silence was guaranteed. They did not expect that she might live long enough to tell us the truth. A sense of urgency filled the room as Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. He cast a glance around the space, noting each face, each subtle reaction. Someone here had acted in the last few moments to strike again, and they would not stop until they were certain they had won, but Poirot had no intention of letting them succeed. He turned to Gerard. We must act quickly, mon ami. This game has entered its final act, and the murderer is more dangerous now than ever before. Poirot stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the teacup resting on the silver tray. His mind was not on the poisoned drink itself, but on the manner in which it had been delivered. A deliberate act, carried out not in panic, but in calculated precision. The tea had been prepared before Madame Langlay had even confessed in anticipation of her downfall. The murderer was not reacting to events, but orchestrating them. His little gray cells hummed as he turned to the room. Gerard was speaking with an officer, issuing orders. while Juliet hovered anxiously near Leckler, who had retreated into a brooding silence. Madame Langlais, now being attended to by a hurriedly summoned physician, remained pale but stable. The pieces of the puzzle were all there scattered, misplaced, but undeniably connected. Poirot had only to see the pattern within them, his eyes. Drifted to the grand piano, its glossy surface reflecting the dim light. The instrument had been at the center of everything from the night of the murder to the destruction of the sheet music. And yet there was something else about it, something he had felt but not yet fully grasped. He stepped closer, his fingertips grazing the smooth wood, and then his gaze settled on the sheet music that remained intact. It was a different composition, one of the many pieces performed in the days leading up to the murder. Poirot's mind flicked back to the moment he had first questioned Leckler. The young pianist had spoken of his father's rigor, his strict insistence on precision. He had recalled, too, the way the maestro had instructed each of his protégés, drilling them on technical perfection. And yet, the night of his death, Leckler had played a piece he had never learned. His mustache twitched. Not quite. He had played it. But with a hesitation, a subtle imperfection. A single wrong note. Poirot straightened, his pulse quickening. He turned sharply to Juliet. "Mademoiselle, you were present on the night of the performance. Tell me, when Leckler played the piece, did you notice anything unusual?" Juliet blinked, startled by the sudden question. I suppose not. It was beautiful, but—" She hesitated. Poirot leaned in slightly. "Yes," she frowned, as if struggling to recall a distant memory. "Now that you mention it," he did stumble. "Just once. A single note NE, I think. It stood out because I had never heard him make a mistake before." Leckler, who had been listening in silence, suddenly stiffened. "That's not possible," he murmured. "Ah." Poirot turned to him, eyes gleaming. "Why not, monsieur?" Leckler hesitated, his fingers tightening at his sides. "Because," he took a breath, "because the piece does not contain an E in that sequence. It would be a misreading of the notation, something I would never do." A hush fell over the room. Poirot exhaled softly. The pattern was becoming clear. It was not a mistake, he said, more to himself than to the others. It was a message. Gerard, who had been following the exchange with increasing impatience, scowled. "What are you saying, Poirot?" Poirot turned to him, his expression unreadable. "I am saying, mon ami, that the answer to this mystery has been in front of us all along. The maestro did not merely die that night. He tried to leave behind a final clue. A dying man's last attempt to name his killer," the inspector frowned. "By playing a wrong note?" "Precisely." Poirot's voice was steady, assured. "A note that should not have been played. One that stood apart, drawing attention to itself." His fingers tapped gently against the piano lid. The maestro knew he was in danger. Perhaps he suspected betrayal, but could not prove it. And so, when the moment came, when he realized he was about to be silenced, he did the only thing he could. He left a sign. Juliet pressed a hand to her lips. "But what does it mean?" Poirot stepped away from the piano, his thoughts racing. "The answer is in the name. Mademoiselle, his gaze swept over the faces before him. The note he played a single E. Leckler's expression darkened. I don't understand. Poirot turned to him, his voice quiet but firm. Think, Monsieur Leckler. Who among us has a name that begins with that letter? Realization dawned, swift and sharp. All eyes turned toward Mile Fournier, the maestro's oldest friend and long-time collaborator who stood near the doorway, his face eerily composed. The very man who had first discovered the body, the man who had seemed so grief-stricken, so eager to see the case closed for the first time. His carefully constructed mask wavered, ridiculous, Fournier scoffed, though his voice was tight. You expect us to believe a man, dying from poison, chose to press a single key as his final act? Poirot's gaze did not waver. Not just a key, monsieur. A name. His voice lowered. Your name. The silence that followed was suffocating. Fournier's hands twitched at his sides, his knuckles whitening. Poirot watched him, unblinking. The maestro trusted you, Poirot continued softly. He confided in you. But you had your own ambitions, your own fears. You knew his success overshadowed your own. And when you discovered that he planned to step away from the stage, perhaps even leaving the conservatory to new leadership someone younger, perhaps you saw your opportunity, Fournier exhaled slowly. You have no proof, Poirot smiled. Faintly. Do I not? His hand gestured toward the piano. The proof is in the music. Fournier said nothing, but Poirot saw at the flicker of doubt, the tightening of his jaw. The game was nearing its end, and the murderer knew it. Gerard took a cautious step forward. Monsieur Fournier, I suggest you come with us, the older. Man did not move. His eyes flicked toward the room's exit, measuring the distance, weighing his options. Poirot saw it in an instant, the same calculation he had seen in countless criminals before, and then Fournier bolted. Gerard shouted, lunging after him, but Poirot remained still, watching as the final act unfolded exactly as he had expected. Fournier had spent his life in concert halls, not in flight. Within moments, 2 officers seized him, wrenching his arms. Behind his back, as they restrained him, his composure cracked. He was going to ruin everything. Fournier spat. He wanted to change everything we built. He had no right. Poirot sighed, shaking his head. Non, monsieur. He had every right. Fournier sagged in the officer's grip, the fight draining from him. The grand piano stood silent once more, its final note still echoing in the minds of those who had heard it. The pattern had emerged, clear as a melody. The maestro had not died in vain, and Poirot, as always, had listened. Fournier's breathing was ragged, his face a contorted mask of fury and something deeper, something raw, almost desperate. The officers tightened their grip on him, but he no longer struggled. He had spent years controlling his image, building his reputation, maintaining the veneer of the devoted friend, the brilliant collaborator. Now all of it was gone. And yet, Poirot sensed that the true reason for his crime had not yet been spoken aloud. Gerard, still catching his breath, turned to Poirot. We have the confession. The case is finished, But Poirot did not move. His sharp eyes remained fixed on Fournier. The maestro's betrayal had cut him deeply, but not enough to drive him to murder. No, there was something else, something beneath the surface, just waiting to be uncovered. Poirot spoke softly. You say he was going to ruin everything, that he had no right. But you do not speak of ambition, nor of legacy. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man's reaction. You speak of something personal. Fournier's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. You were his closest friend, Poirot continued. His confidant. For years, you stood by his side, sharing in his success, his music, his life. And yet, something changed. Poirot took a step closer. What was it, Fournier? What did he take from you? Fournier exhaled sharply through his nose, but his silence spoke louder than words. Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping over the others in the room. Juliet, pale and shaken. Leclerc, still in stunned disbelief. Gerard, impatient but curious. And then Poirot saw it, the flicker of recognition in Juliet's eyes, the way her hands clenched at her sides. Ah, Poirot murmured. Of course. Juliet's lips parted slightly, as though she wished to protest, but she remained silent. Poirot turned back to Fournier. It was not about the conservatory, nor about music, nor even about respect. His voice lowered. It was about love. Fournier's breath hitched, and Poirot knew he had struck the heart of it. Juliet, Poirot said, his voice gentler. Now, you were more than a student to the maestro, were you not? Juliet's eyes darted to Fournier, then to Leclerc, before she finally whispered, He loved me. Leclerc made a small, strangled sound, his face clouding with emotion. And you? Poirot pressed. Juliet's gaze dropped. I admired him. I respected him. But no, I did not love him. The words landed in the silence. Like a final note in an unfinished symphony, Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. And you, Fournier? You saw it, did you not? The way he looked at her, the way he spoke of her. Fournier's face twisted. He didn't deserve her. He hissed. He thought he could take whatever he wanted, his success, his students, his influence, and now even her. His voice broke. He didn't see me. Not really. Not for years. And then, when I realized what he was planning, Poirot finished for him. You could not allow it. Fournier's head fell forward, a mirthless laugh escaping him. He told me, he muttered. The night before he died, he told me he intended to propose, that he would leave the conservatory, step away from his career for her, his hands curled into fists. I had stood beside him for decades, given everything, sacrificed everything. And in the end, he was going to throw it all away for someone who would never love him back. His shoulders trembled. He was willing to abandon his music. But I could not let him do it. Poirot inhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling over him. You killed him, he said, because he chose love over everything you both built together. Fournier's eyes burned. No, he said bitterly. I killed him because he never chose me. A heavy silence followed. stretching through the room like the final reverberation of a tragic melody. Poirot saw it now, not just the jealousy, not just the betrayal, but the unbearable ache of a love unspoken, a devotion unreturned. The crime had not been about power nor greed. It had been about the one thing even the most brilliant minds could not control. Poirot sighed. Ah, Fournier. The heart is the most dangerous instrument of all. Fournier's breathing was shallow, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the room, as if retreating inward. The weight of his confession hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Poirot, ever the master of timing, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough not to break Fournier, but to make him feel the inevitability of what came next. Gerard, his face tight with satisfaction, shifted impatiently. "This is enough," he said. "We have his confession." "We should," but Poirot raised a hand, silencing him without looking away from Fournier. "A confession, yes," he murmured, "but not yet a resolution." Something flickered in Fournier's eyes, a brief moment of calculation before he schooled his expression once more. Poirot did not miss it. Even now, the man was thinking, considering his options, measuring the angles. A desperate man might lash out, but Fournier was not a fool. He was a strategist, a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. And Poirot knew better than to assume he would surrender easily. The detective stepped closer, his voice low, measured. "You are not one to act without preparation, mon ami. This was not a crime of passion. It was done with care, precision." He tilted his head. "And yet, something troubles me." Fournier blinked, but said nothing. Poirot continued, pacing slowly. "You say you killed him because he never saw. You never chose you. But I must ask myself why now? Why not years ago, when the resentment first took root? Why not when the opportunities were plentiful?" He turned back sharply, his gaze piercing. Why wait until he was about to leave everything behind? Fournier stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Poirot did not relent. "Because, mon cher Fournier, I do not think you intended to kill him at all." A ripple of unease spread through the room. Juliet looked between them, her hands clenched together. Leclerc frowned, his mind racing. Gerard exhaled, irritated. "What are you saying, Poirot?" He admitted to it. "Oh, he played his role beautifully," Poirot said. "And indeed, he may have been willing to let us believe it. But I ask you, why would a man as meticulous as Fournier, a man who has built his entire life around control, commit such a crime in a way so inelegant?" He let the words settle before delivering his final move. "Unless, of course, the murder did not go as planned." Fournier's face twitched, but he forced a cold smirk. "This is nonsense." Poirot smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Then let us test this nonsense, we." He gestured toward the table, where a single piece of evidence remained, a sheet of music, the one Juliet had recovered from the maestro's office. The same one Poirot had studied so carefully. "You left us a message, Fournier, without realizing it." The maestro's final composition unfinished, but not unmarked. Leclerc's breath hitched. "The ink smudge." "Oui," Poirot said. At first, I believed it to be accidental. But no, this was his last act, his final statement. He picked up the sheet, pointing to the dark stain near the edge. Not ink, but blood. A ripple of understanding passed through the room. Poirot turned back to Fournier. You did not intend to kill him that night. Perhaps you only meant to confront him, to make him understand the depth of his betrayal. But something went wrong. He stepped closer, his voice pressing in like a blade. What was it, Fournier? Did he fight back? Did he say something that pushed you over the edge? Fournier remained stone-faced, but his fingers twitched a minute. In voluntary response, Poirot pressed further. Or did someone else enter the room? The reaction was immediate. Fournier flinched, his control slipping for the first time. Juliet gasped, stepping back. No, you don't mean. Poirot nodded grimly. We. The maestro was not alone when he died. A sharp intake of breath filled the space, the realization cutting through them all. Fournier's silence was deafening. Poirot spoke carefully now, the final piece falling into place. You confronted him, but the argument was overheard. Someone else was there. Someone who had even more to lose. He turned, his gaze settling on the one person who had remained still, too still, throughout it all. Leckler. The man's hands trembled slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words. Came. Poirot's voice softened, but there was no mercy in it. Is that not so, Monsieur Leckler? Leckler's breath came quick and shallow. He shook his head. No, that's absurd. Poirot did not move. You were his business partner, his friend. But you also stood to lose everything. Fournier may have felt betrayed by his departure, but you would have been ruined. Leckler's face paled. That's not true. Poirot took a slow step forward. You heard them arguing. You saw your opportunity. Perhaps you thought Fournier would take the blame, that no one would question it. He gestured toward the sheet of music again. But the maestro, even in death, left us his final clue. His voice dropped to a near whisper. It was not Fournier he marked. It was you. The room held its breath. Leckler's body was rigid, his eyes darting. To the door, to the officers, to Fournier. Panic flickered in his gaze. He had played his part too well, believing the case had closed. Now, with nowhere left to run, he did the only thing left. He lunged, but Poirot had expected this. Even as Leckler made his desperate move, the officers were ready. In a swift, brutal motion, they caught him, forcing him down, twisting his arms behind his back. He struggled, but it was futile. Fournier, still standing, watched it unfold in stunned silence. Poirot exhaled. You did not kill him, Fournier, but your actions set it in motion. He turned to Leckler, whose face was twisted with rage and defeat. And you, mon cher, did the rest. Leckler let out a bitter laugh. He was going to leave me with nothing. He spat. He didn't care. None of you did. Poirot merely shook his head. No, monsieur. It was you who cared for. Nothing but yourself. The weight of the case finally settled. The final note struck. The room once filled with deception and doubt, was now silent, save for the rustling of handcuffs and the slow, resigned breathing of a man who had lost everything. Poirot turned away, straightening his coat. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and the maestro's final song had, at last, reached its end. Poirot's gaze lingered on the closed door through which the trembling figure of Marcel Lucier had just been led away. The room, already steeped in despair and disbelief, seemed to exhale a collective sigh, one that mingled relief with the profound sorrow of all that had been lost. For a long moment, silence reigned, heavy and inexorable. Then Poirot began to speak in a low, measured tone that wove together the final strands of a symphony of deceit and retribution. "You see," he said slowly, addressing the assembled officers, Madame Langlais now weak, but still clinging to life and even a subdued. Leclerc and Fournier, all along, the truth was not as simple as our initial perceptions would have us believe. The entire sequence of events, the misplayed note, the poisoned tea, the carefully staged confrontations were the work of a mind that had long been lurking in the shadows of forgotten grievances. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room like a soft refrain. For many years, Marcel Lucier has lived in the periphery of the maestro's life. Once a mentor, perhaps even a father figure, he was overshadowed, consigned to obscurity, as his pupil's star ascended. In that abyss of neglect, bitterness took root. His genius, however, was not diminished. It merely twisted into a darker form of artistry, a desire to orchestrate events as one might compose a grand, final masterpiece. A tremor passed through the crowd. Madame Langlais's eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. Juliet clutched her hands together, as if in prayer. Even Leclerc, the man who had earlier seemed so confident in his own culpability, now wore an expression of dismay as he realized the vastness of the deception. Poirot's voice grew firmer. Every detail, the wrong note played on that fateful night, the deliberate misdirection in our investigations, the cunning removal of critical evidence, all served a singular purpose. Lucier intended not merely to remove a man from the stage, but to dismantle the very fabric of the legacy that the maestro had built. He longed to reclaim a past he believed had been stolen from him, to exact a revenge that transcended mere monetary gain or petty jealousy. Inspector Gerard shifted uneasily. "Monsieur Poirot, are you suggesting that everything we thought we understood, the confessions, the confrontations, were just diversions? That the true architect of this tragedy was still at large, manipulating events from behind the scenes?" Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed. It appears that the confusion we witnessed, the conflicting accounts, the hidden motives were all part of a much grander design. Lucier was always several steps ahead, playing a tune that none of us could hear until it was too late. His subtle hand was in every misdirected clue, the burned sheet music that we reassembled to reveal a final, damning message, the peculiar smudge on Madame Langlais's glove, and even the offhand remarks that led us to suspect the obvious culprits." A murmur rippled through the room as the gravity of Poirot's words sank in. "And now," he continued, "we have witnessed the last-minute twist and unexpected confrontation that reveals that the real mastermind was not the petty schemer we had envisioned, but a man consumed by the ghosts of his past. Marcel Lucier, whose name has been hidden in plain sight, has shown us that even when the final act seems to have been played, the true score can change in an instant, at that moment, as if summoned by Poirot's revelation. A soft knock resounded from behind a heavy curtain that lined a side corridor. The officers exchanged puzzled glances, and Gerard moved cautiously to investigate. Behind the curtain, barely visible in the dim light, lay a small wooden box, its surface intricately carved with musical motifs. Poirot gently retrieved it and opened it with deliberate care. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, but unmistakably penned in a familiar hand. The letter detailed a bitter monologue of betrayal and despair, a confession of sorts, from Lucier himself, outlining his feelings of being eclipsed and forgotten, of watching his former pupil rise to greatness at his expense. Poirot read aloud, his voice quiet yet resonant. "I have lived in the shadow of genius for too long. When the day came that he turned his back on me, I resolved that his legacy, built on a foundation of neglect, would be dismantled. Every note he played, every step he took towards self-destruction, was part of my final composition. I set the stage, and you all danced to my tune, even if unknowingly." A gasp swept through the group. Even Madame Langlais, her condition fragile, stared in disbelief. Juliet's eyes filled with tears for the man she had once admired, now revealed as a vengeful architect of ruin. Leclerc's face turned ashen, and Fournier's earlier anger seemed to dissipate into a profound sorrow. Poirot closed the letter with a slow, deliberate snap. "This, mes amis, is the final piece of the puzzle." Lucier's ultimate plan was not to steal a patron's wealth or exact a simple revenge, but to erase the legacy of a man who, in his brilliance, forgot those who truly nurtured him. In his own twisted way, Lucier sought to restore balance, to remind the world that every note, every gesture, has its echo. The officers gathered around, their expressions a mix of grim determination and reluctant awe. Inspector Gerard stepped forward, his voice low. "Monsieur Poirot, what are our next steps?" Poirot's eyes, ever vigilant, swept the room once more, taking in the faces of those who had unwittingly played their parts in Lucier's grand scheme. "We must ensure that justice is served in its entirety," he declared. "Not only must those who physically committed the crimes be held accountable, but we must also acknowledge the deeper wounds that have been inflicted, a wound of neglect, of unrequited ambition, and of love betrayed by time." He paused, then added with quiet finality, "Lucier's message, though wrapped in vengeance, serves as a somber reminder. Every action, every note in our lives is part of a greater composition. And though tonight the final twist has come to light, let it be known that no one escapes the consequences of the past." As the officers began to document the newfound evidence and prepare for Lucier's subsequent interrogation, Poirot lingered by the window, gazing out at a night sky filled with scattered stars. In that silent moment, he reflected on the nature of genius and the destructive power of unhealed wounds. The maestro's tragic final performance had been more than a murder. It had been a requiem for a lost era, a testament to the fact that, even in the realm of art, the human heart can compose its most deadly symphonies. And as the sound of distant footsteps echoed down the corridor, a reminder that Lucier was not yet fully in custody, Poirot's mind raced with one final thought, that the harmony of truth, though elusive and ever-changing, would ultimately prevail, even if it meant that the echoes of this tragic night would haunt them all for years to come. The night air carried the distant sound of sirens, a slow, deliberate hum that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. Inside the grand estate, silence reigned thick, heavy, and expectant. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his small frame casting long shadows against the gilded walls. Across from him, Inspector Gerard reviewed the damning letter once more, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Marcel Lucier," Gerard murmured, shaking his head. "A man who orchestrated a tragedy from the shadows, believing himself the unseen hand of justice. And yet, in the end, all he has proven is the depths of his own bitterness." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Bitterness, mon ami, is often the root of the most calculated crimes. But even the most meticulous of composers can misjudge a note. You see, Lucier believed himself to be in complete control, his scheme woven so tightly that we would never unravel it in time. And yet, he failed to account for one thing." Gerard glanced up. "And what is that?" Poirot allowed a small smile. "Me." A sudden commotion erupted in the hallway. Officers shouted, their hurried footsteps echoing like gunfire. Poirot and Gerard exchanged a glance before rushing toward the source of the disturbance. Down the corridor, a trail of bodies stunned, winded, but alive marked Lucier's desperate flight. An overturned chair, a fallen lamp, a door left ajar. In his wake, the realization struck Poirot instantly. He is escaping. Gerard cursed under his breath, barking orders to his men. Close every exit. The estate must be locked down. Poirot, however, remained still, his mind working rapidly through the sequence of events. Lucier was clever, too clever to run blindly into the night without a plan. His exit had been calculated, which meant the garden. Poirot whispered to himself. The old passage. With a sudden burst of movement, he turned on his heel, racing toward the east wing where a forgotten greenhouse stood cloaked in ivy. The path was treacherous, overgrown with years of neglect, but Poirot knew Lucier would count on that very detail to remain unseen. By the time Poirot reached the garden, Lucier was already there, struggling with a rusted gate. His usually composed face was flushed, sweat beading along his brow as he wrestled with time itself. "Marcel," Poirot called, his voice neither triumphant nor taunting, merely steady. "It is over." Lucier froze but did not turn immediately. Instead, he let out a sharp exhale, one that carried a lifetime of resentment. "You never should have seen it," he murmured. "The pattern, the truth behind it all." Poirot took a careful step forward. "And yet, I did." Lucier's fingers flexed against the iron bars. "You think you've won, Poirot, that justice has prevailed. But tell me, does it feel like justice? That Langlais, the man who discarded those who made him, lies dead, and yet his sins will be buried with him. That those who profited from his arrogance continue unscathed." Poirot tilted his head. "And do you feel justified, Lucier?" Does the ruin you have orchestrated feel like redemption, or merely the echoes of a man who wished to be remembered for something other than his absence? Lucier laughed, a short, hollow sound. And what does it matter now? It matters, Poirot said gently, because your story is not yet finished. Lucier turned then, his gaze searching Poirot's face as though looking for an answer even he did not fully understand. For a brief moment, the weight of his crimes, the futility of his vengeance, flickered in his expression. Then, with the quiet acceptance of a man whose last note had already been played, he lifted his hands in surrender. By the time Gerard and his men arrived, Lucier stood motionless, his fate sealed not by the law alone, but by the truth he could no longer escape ours. Later, as dawn painted the sky in muted hues of violet and gold, Poirot stood by the window, his thoughts drifting through the remnants of the night's revelations. Gerard, now leaning against the desk, exhaled. He spoke little after his arrest. Only one thing, really. He asked if it had all been for nothing. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And what did you tell him? Gerard sighed. That history will decide. Poirot nodded slowly. Justice, mon ami, is not always a matter of punishment. Sometimes it is merely the burden of truth itself. Gerard studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You truly do see more than most, don't you? Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. Mais oui, Inspector. It is both my gift and my curse. As the first light of morning filtered into the room, the case was closed. And yet, the echoes of its final notes would linger perhaps not in the grand halls of history, but in the quiet spaces where truth, justice, and regret coexist in uneasy harmony. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the quiet estate, Poirot fastened the buttons on his coat with precise, deliberate movements. The case was closed, the culprit apprehended, and justice, if not in its purest form, had been served. And yet, as he prepared to take his leave, a peculiar sensation lingered. A quiet, nagging thought, like an unfinished melody humming at the edge of his mind. Inspector Gerard, standing near the entrance, crossed his arms as he watched Poirot. You should be pleased, mon ami. Another mystery unraveled. The papers will call it your finest work. Poirot smiled faintly. The papers, mon cher, have an unfortunate tendency to romanticize. Justice, in reality, is rarely so poetic. Gerard arched an eyebrow. You're not satisfied. Satisfaction is a peculiar thing, Poirot murmured, glancing back toward the estate. We have followed every thread, pursued every lead, and yet his fingers traced the edge of his cuff, a habit of his when deep in thought. There is something, how shall I say, out of place. Gerard sighed. Poirot, Lucier confessed. His motive was clear, the evidence undeniable. What else is there to doubt? Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. It is not doubt, mon ami. It is certainty of something. Overlooked, he turned, his gaze sweeping over the estate one last time. The windows reflected nothing but the morning light. The garden lay undisturbed save for the remnants of the previous night's pursuit. Everything in its place. And yet, The sensation persisted. Poirot reached into his pocket, retrieving the small, folded piece of parchment, Lucier's final note. The ink had dried, but its message remained fresh in his mind. He read it once more. You never should have seen it. The pattern. The truth behind it all. At the time, he had assumed Lucier spoke of the crime itself, of the web of revenge he had so carefully woven. But what if there was another layer, another pattern yet to be uncovered? His eyes flickered toward the grand staircase inside the estate. A house with many rooms, many secrets. He turned to Gerard. Tell me, mon ami, was every room in this house searched? Gerard frowned. Of course. Thoroughly, even the ones no longer in use? Gerard hesitated. What are you getting at? Poirot's gaze remained locked on the upper floors. It is a curious thing, is it not, that a man as meticulous as Lucier would allow himself to be captured in so careless a manner? As if he had already made peace with the outcome, you think. He wanted to be caught? Non, Poirot corrected. I think he knew it would not matter. A slow realization dawned in Gerard's expression. You're saying there's something else? Poirot nodded. A mystery never ends so neatly, mon cher. There is always another door left ajar. Without another word, he turned back toward the estate, his mind already racing ahead. Whatever Lucier had left behind, Poirot intended to find it, because a case was never truly closed, not when the final note had yet to be played.